now. There may be a little bit of delay in the audio, but anyway, thanks so much, Yanni, for the introduction. And just to tell a little bit about myself, I am the ag extension agent in Hall County up here in Gainesville. But as far as my education, I got a degree in biology, and my graduate degree was in plant pathology. And prior to this position, I worked for the USDA for 7 years in a plant pathology lab where we did all sorts of research on plant disease. And so it's really important. And definitely it's one of the most frustrating things in our landscape if we start having issues with diseases. So, my goal for the talk today, rather than going in, I'll go into some specifics as far as some diseases that we commonly see, but I really want to tell you all kind of just the different kinds of diseases that we get, and then how to manage those, and whether that's with a fungicide or these cultural practices we can have that can help mitigate that, and we don't have as many issues. So, further ado, I'll jump right into it, and we'll start talking about plant disease. One of my favorite things to talk about. But why do we want to control disease? Well, of course, in a landscape setting in our backyard, we want things to look good. And if we have a home garden, we want to have the most yield at the end. We want to have the most tomatoes, the most peppers. So risk to your investment. And so that's not just the investment of the plant you bought for your landscape, but it's also your time investment. So let's say you have a plant that has been in your landscape for 7 years, and then it goes kaput. So you've lost all that time. So we want to protect our time investment, our money investment. um, you know, Disease can cause billions of dollars in losses from crops to landscapes. And then also it's been involved in major historical events. And so while this isn't with landscaping, I love to bring this up because it really shows the significance that plant disease can have in our world. So many of you have probably heard of the Great Irish Potato Famine, but this was in 1844. And in that short span that we had this disease, it was caused by a pathogen called Phytophthora. It's a real common landscape disease, lots of different Phytoptheras. But in that time, over 1 million people passed away, and we had one of the largest migration events ever in the history of mankind, where over 1.5 million people immigrated from Ireland. So I have Irish descent, and a lot of folks do. And so, that's one of the reasons that so many Irish immigrants came to this country, was because of this plant disease that caused all this havoc. Also in America, usually when we think of very big trees, we think of the West Coast with the redwoods that they have out there. But here on the East Coast, we used to have trees that were bigger than the redwoods they have over on the West Coast in California. And when we used to have the American chestnut, you can see this photo here. I love this picture, but it was huge for the logging industry at the time. But in 1904, we had the introduction of a fungal plant disease called chestnut blight, and now there's essentially no American chestnuts in our country anymore. And during that time, 4 billion chestnuts went kaput. And we still have chestnuts, but they get to the point where they can produce seed and then they die, because this disease here will girdle the plant, and it'll kill it that way. But just some significant things with plant disease. I like to keep it in perspective here. But just to talk about what is plant disease. So it's the impairment of a normal function of a plant. That's why they look crazy or they look bad when they get infected. It's the result of a continuous irritation. And I say that because plant disease doesn't have to be caused by one of these pathogens like a fungus or a bacteria. It can be caused from an environmental factor if there's not enough nutrition, if the soil's too compacted. So it's a continual irritation. If you were to fix that problem, the plant would heal. So it progresses over times, and then it leads to the development of symptoms. And we'll talk about what symptoms are, and why it's important to recognize those. So that little segue I had right there. In plant disease, there are signs and there's symptoms. And so a sign of a plant disease is when you actually physically see it. So this disease right here, you're probably all very aware of it. This is something called powdery mildew. It's one of the more common landscape diseases. But this white powdery stuff is the actual fungus on the leaf. So if I see the fungus, I see a sign. That's a sign that that disease is there. Um, the symptoms, though, is what that disease causes. So if you look at the squash plant right here, it is wilting. And so that disease has messed up the roots. And because it's messed up the roots, the plant can't get enough water up to the leaves and you get wilting. So the wilting is a symptom of that pathogen being there. So just kind of a nice distinction there. But the reasons we get diseases, I said it doesn't always have to be from something like a fungus, but the causes of disease are either biotic factors or abiotic factors. And so uh, biotic factors would be fungi, bacteria. We have viruses that infect plants and nematodes too. And I'll talk a little bit about those. But one thing I like to tell people is 80% of plant disease is caused by fungi. So really, most of the time when we have a disease issue, it's caused by a fungus, 80% of that. And then about 10% is bacteria. And then what's left over is nematodes and viruses. But fungi really cause a lot of issues with our plants and our landscapes if it comes to that. Now, abiotic factors, diseases that aren't caused by one of these pests here, it could be air pollution. It could be herbicides. That happens all the time in gardens where we try to spray our lawns and then we get a little bit of drift and our tomatoes get dinged. Or it could just be that there's not enough nutrition. So those are all things that can cause disease and our plants to suffer because of that. So to talk about the differences between abiotic diseases and biotic ones is, when you're trying to figure out what's going wrong with your landscape, it's good to recognize patterns. Now, abiotic diseases, so if it's caused by an environmental stress, drought stress, usually there's very uniform symptoms. Every single plant in your row is dead, or every leaf is showing us symptoms like this right here. Uh, but when we look at these actual pathogens like fungi and bacteria, it's more of a random pattern. So if you had a whole population of plants, you'd expect one of these is dead, this one over here is dead, this one over here is dead. And so most things in nature are not uniform. So if you see a random pattern like that, it's more often one of these fungal or bacterial pests versus something that maybe we messed up, like I sprayed somewhere I shouldn't have, and it got everything in that area. So that's a good pattern to recognize, is that the fungi are like random. But one of the first things they teach in when you start studying plant pathology or plant disease is something called the disease triangle. And so this is just a really good concept to get in your head that can kind of help you really understand disease and kind of know how to tackle it if it becomes a problem. So to have plant disease, you have to have three things. You have to have a host. So that's the plant that the fungus is infecting, for example. You have to have the pathogen, the fungus itself, and the environment has to be right. So fungi love wet, warm weather. For example, if we have a bunch of leaf spots on our prized landscaping plant, if we do things to reduce leaf wetness, like water at the base of the plant, or allow more airflow through pruning to dry those leaves out, a lot of times that can help fix the problem. So you have to have a host that is susceptible to that disease. One of the questions I commonly get is people ask me, well, I got this disease on my crepe myrtles Is it going to jump over to my roses and kill them? Well, the answer is no, because a lot of pathogens are very host specific. So that fungus that's attacking that crepe myrtle only attacks crepe myrtles, and that disease that's on your roses only affects roses in most cases. So just a good thing to kind of get a concept of. But every disease has a certain cycle, and really the benefit of knowing what the life cycle is of these diseases is to know what we can do to try to prevent them without using chemical, or if we need to use chemical, when we need to apply those. So a lot of diseases, like when you have a disease that gets on the foliage and screws it up and they fall below the plant, a lot of those fungi will overwinter on that plant debris to reinfect your plant next year. So one of the things we can do to try to reduce that disease for next year is we can clean up all those dead leaves underneath the plant, put them in a grocery bag, a trash bag, just get them away from that plant. And then you've reduced the spores that are going to infect your plant next year. So that's understanding its life cycle, where it overwinters at. Also, when does it infect? Does it infect in the bloom? If it does, for example, with peaches, there's a bad disease called brown rot. It infects as soon as that flower opens up. And so by knowing that life cycle, we know if we're going to put out a fungicide, let's put it out right before those flowers open. And then that plant will be protected when it's most vulnerable to attack. Okay. All right. So I love plant diagnosis because it's kind of like being a detective, figuring out what's going on by looking at patterns and just trying to ask a lot of questions. But some of the good things to know when you're trying to figure out what a disease is or if it's disease is just to kind of know the plant. I love this picture here is of a plant called Japanese Akubia. It kind of has this real crazy looking foliage here, but for that plant, that's totally normal. And a lot of people, there's viruses that cause symptoms like that. So people will think sometimes that a virus has infected my plant, but that's just what it looks like. So know the plant, a little bit about it. And then also you want to get an idea of the history, to try to figure out what is going on with the plant. So what did you fertilize with? When did you fertilize? Are you watering? If you are, when and how much are you watering? Was there an herbicide used somewhere in the landscape? These are all things that can cause issues, and so getting an idea of that to try to narrow down what exactly is going on. And then, of course, we talked about earlier, is it a uniform symptom or is it random? And that can help decide if it's being caused by a fungus or bacteria, or if it's an environmental thing like heat stress, all sorts of other factors. But most problems are abiotic. So they're either caused by the environment, but more often, so many times, it's something we did, even though we don't like to admit it. It's something that we did on accident that has messed up our plant in some way. The best thing you can do to prevent plant disease is put the right plant in the right place. So if you have azaleas and they like to be in the shade, don't put them out in the full sun, because plants are just like people. When we get stressed out, our immune system is compromised and we get sick easier. Well, plants are the exact same way. If I put an azalea in full sun, that it's not adapted to that environment, it's going to get stressed out, and then it's going to get one of these diseases because its immune system's compromised. So putting the right plant in the right place is the best thing you can do to try to prevent disease in your landscape. And so just keeping that in mind. But most diseases are abiotic. So planting errors. Did you plant too deep? If you have these woody perennials like boxwoods, or if you're planting a maple tree, one of the biggest mistakes people make, we see so often in extension, is where people will plant that too deep, and that that trunk is not adapted to be in a wet, moist environment like the soil is. And so you get the introduction of diseases. It'll cause the roots to start forming where they shouldn't. You get all these issues, and the plant usually dies if it's planted too deep. So that's one thing. What's wrong with my tree? I see so many times where people will park their car in their driveway right next to their tree, and they do that for years. And eventually, the limbs on that side of the tree start to die and fall down, and hopefully not on top of your car. But the reason that that killed your branches on that side is because when you parked your car right there, you compacted the soil. And we've learned since the second grade that plants take in CO2, they put off oxygen, but plants need oxygen too, and especially the roots. So when we compact that soil, that gets rid of all the available oxygen in that soil, and it basically smothers the roots, kills them, and then you start seeing issues in the canopy after it can't get the nutrition and water that it needs up to those areas. So that's why compacted soil will kill plants. Herbicide damage. These are all on tomatoes. I see this all the time. Real symptom of tomatoes that have been hit by herbicides. This would be like an example of 2,4-D. The leaves will kind of curl up and cup, and so that's real indicative that there's been an herbicide issue. They can cause all sorts of weird stuff. A lot of herbicides are growth hormone regulators. They mess up the growth hormones of the plants, and so it causes them to do all sorts of crazy things, and they basically just grow until they die. So that's how a lot of herbicides work. Now, there's always nutritional deficiencies. Obviously, we want to get our plants the best nutrition that they can have, but sometimes the coloration of the foliage can tell us a little bit about what the deficiency is. The most common nutritional deficiency that I see is nitrogen. Basically, you just get a real pale green color. And as soon as you get the nitrogen that it needs, it'll beef back up. Phosphorus turns the leaves a real purple color if there's a deficiency in that. Iron is kind of a real pale yellow. I don't really agree with this picture of iron. I think it's more yellow like this. But iron is one of those things that you can actually spray iron on the foliage, and the foliage can take up iron. So that's one way to get it to it. But there's all sorts of symptoms that are caused by these different deficiencies, depending on what the micronutrient or nutrient that's in deficiency is. Okay, so again, 80% of disease is caused by fungi. Bacteria is about 10%, and then viruses and nematodes cause issues too. We'll talk about those. But the big overlapping one we said it causes 80% of plant disease is fungi. And I just want to tell you real quick a couple of characteristics about fungi. They use spores to reproduce. So a lot of times we're trying to put down a fungicide to prevent those spores from germinating. A real common misconception that I think people have is that a fungicide kills the fungus. No, it doesn't. A fungicide is kind of like a shield that you put over your plant. So when that fungicide is on your leaf and that spore lands on the leaf, it just prevents that spore from germinating and infecting, but it doesn't get rid of it. And so it's just a good distinction to have. It's kind of like putting sunscreen on your plant. It works until it wears off, and then your plant's at risk again. So the fungi spread by hyphae. It looks kind of like a spider web. You can see it here, that kind of spider web material. And then it also can have lots of different survival structures that we won't get into. But not all fungi are bad to plants. I just want to point that out. There's some symbiotic relationships with fungi and plants that are very beneficial to both parties. If you've ever gone mushroom foraging for chanterelles, I love chanterelles. That is a mycorrhizal relationship between a tree, usually an oak, and that fungus. And so the fungus helps the tree uptake nutrients, and then the fungus gets a little piece of the pie. So it gets some of those nutrients that the tree gets. And then And that's why you can't grow your own chanterelles at your house, or you can't grow your own truffles, is because it has to be in a relationship with this tree for it to occur. So that's why you have to go foraging for some of these mushrooms rather than just growing them in your house. Okay, so but the most common fungal issue we see is leaf spots. These are the pictures of some spores of real common leaf spot causing diseases, but you know, we've all seen this on our plants. Almost every plant has some sort of leaf spot disease that can affect it. Um, but you know, I mentioned earlier, fungi love to have wet environments, and so it's so important when we try to manage disease. Before we think to use that fungicide, let's think about reducing leaf wetness. So how do we do that? Easiest one with tomatoes or whatever, if you're going to water those, water them at the base. You know, don't pour a bunch of water on top of the foliage, because then it just stays wet. And if you are going to water from the top, do it in the morning, and that will give that plant all day to dry out, versus doing it at night and then it stays wet all night. And you know, then you're just asking for trouble when that happens. So um, you know, they can cause this spotting, all sorts of fungal diseases that can cause this. And in extreme cases, when it gets really bad, they start to defoliate plants. And then if you take away one thing from this talk, plants need leaves. They just got to have them. So if they don't have any leaves, they're going to have issues. We understand that that is how they get their energy, their food from the sun. So without those, they're not going to do too well. But again, there's almost a leaf spot for every plant out there. So you will probably see it if you haven't already in your landscapes. Now, this is a lot of words on this slide here, but you know, rather than getting bogged down with all that, basically, you know, reduce leaf wetness. So we can do that by irrigating at the right time. Do it in the morning or before noon, so it gives those that foliage time to dry out. Sanitation. So we talked about that earlier. Clean up the leaf debris around that plant, because a lot of that fungi and that pathogen is going to stay on that dead debris all winter long, and then next year when the temperatures get right, it's going to sporulate and then it's going to reinfect. So cleaning up that dead debris around your plant does worlds of difference as far as reducing disease for the next year. You know, don't apply a fungicide unless you have to. But then if you do, you can get a recommendation from Yanni or your local extension agent. And then we can also kind of help tell you when the best time to put that out is. But usually the label on that product will tell you most of that information. And then it's good to keep records, of course, of issues, so you can kind of see how the improvement is occurring, or you know, how it's progressing if the disease becomes a further issue. Again, see all these dead leaves here, that has all this rose black spot on it, I'm sure. Diplocarpon, that's the name of that fungus, and it's just going to come and reinfect your plant for next year. So clean up all that junk down there, and that can do wonders. And that we don't have to use any chemicals for that. That's just a good old cultural practice. To go into specifics of a couple of fungal diseases that you'll probably see in your landscape, powdery mildew, that's the most common one. I see that all the time. This is one that actually does pretty well when it's dry. It's one of the reasons they have powdery mildew out in Texas. Here in Georgia, we're like the plant disease mecca. Like, this is the promised land here because we are wet and we're humid. Fungi love it. But powdery mildew can actually do all right if it's dry. So with that, you know, we can use fungicides in that case. You know, this is putting resistance varieties. Now, I mentioned the best thing you can do is put the right plant in the right place. But you know, in so many crops, and not just in landscape, but in crops too, the best thing you can do to combat plant disease is put out a resistant variety. So a lot of plants have a natural resistance, or certain varieties of that plant may have more of a resistance to that disease. So if it's a real problem all the time, you can plant something, a different variety that might not have as many issues with that disease. And then, of course, there's applying fungicides. With leaf spot diseases, chlorothalonil is an ingredient. If that fungicide has chlorothalonil in it, it almost covers any fungal leaf spot that is out there. Something with chlorothalonil or propiconazole, real broad spectrum fungicides. Um, there are rust diseases. I want to show you a couple of pictures of rust. So they can do some real wacky things. They have the craziest life cycle. And if I talked about the life cycle of rust, I would be talking the rest of this presentation about it. But basically, they have to have two different plants to complete their life cycle. So if you have cedar apple rust, the reason it's called cedar apple rust is because for that disease to occur, you have to have an apple tree and you have to have a cedar tree. So if you're planting those together, you're kind of asking for it with this particular disease. The tough thing about rust, though, is that spore can travel in the wind so far that even if you get rid of all your cedar trees in your apple orchard, it may be from a cedar tree 5 miles down the road that is allowing that fungus to complete its life cycle. If you ever see an orange spot on a plant, it is probably a rust. If you see orange, think rust. That's how they got its name, is it looks that rusty color. But if you see an orange spot, it's most likely a rust. They can cause all sorts of weird looking things on plants with the different life cycles that they have. I'm not even going to go into the details because I'll get carried away, because I think rusts are fascinating. But a real common one we see with our daylilies. This is daylily rust. This is one of the most common diseases of daylilies. But again, you see all this orange powder. So if you see that, think rust. It's going to ding up your foliage. And there's a couple of fungicides that work pretty well on that, like propiconazole. But a lot of folks have camellias in their landscape. People come to me and they say, my leaves look crazy. They look all rubbery and thick. That's something called camellia leaf gall. And we're still learning a lot about that disease. I couldn't give you a fungicide recommendation because we really don't have one yet. We're still learning about it. There's a lot of research being done at the university right now on this disease. But the best thing you can do is, if you see this goofy looking leaf, go over and just pick it off. And then, because that'll keep it from falling underneath that plant, and then those spores will harbor on that and infect your plant next year. That goes for a lot of leaf spot diseases. If there's not very many leaves that are infected, just go pick them off, and that'll help reduce it from spreading in that plant. Branch and stem dieback. So if the whole branch is dead, so this was kind of like being a detective, like wanting to think, we have to think about, why would that whole branch be dead? Well, the branch is dead because either somebody snapped it, or some kind of pathogen got into that branch and then disrupted the vascular flow. So a lot of diseases do that. And in this case, the fungus got into that branch right there, and it plugged it up, and it made it where it couldn't get the nutrition it needed to the tips of the branches. So we see a whole branch die. And so when I see something like that, the first thing I do is I start to investigate, and I try to find the area on that branch where the issue occurred. And then you can either find the canker, the fungus that got in there, or you find where the branch snapped. But something happened on that branch that kept the nutrition it needed to get to the tips. So that's kind of being a detective there. If you have Leland cypresses, my thoughts and prayers go out to you. They just have so many issues. Anything under the sun, Leland cypresses, they have a real shallow root system. So when it gets dry, like right now, they get stressed out. They get all sorts of diseases. But this is a real common one we see. It's called Ceridium canker. And if you'll notice, I talked about branch dieback. This branch is dead. This branch is dead. This branch is dead. So I know that something is happening in the branches. And if I were to trace that back on that branch, eventually I'd find a little slit that had a bunch of sap coming out of it. And that sap is full of this fungus the spores from this fungus. And so if I was trying to help her, if I was trying to prevent the spread of this disease, I would get my pruners and I would go 4 inches back from where that canker occurred and I'd prune it out. And you really want to make sure to sanitize your pruners when you do that, because otherwise you're just taking those spores and moving it from this branch to that branch. So I prefer a 70% solution of alcohol. You can use a bleach solution, but if you do use bleach, make sure to get it all off your pruners, because otherwise it'll rust your pruners and then you lose a good pair of pruners that way. But root rot diseases, I saw a lot of that this week. I had a site visit with one of our grain industry reps, and we went out to look at a bunch of blue rug juniper. But root diseases, the factor that causes root disease is really wet soils. So you plant something in some place that's at a low point in your landscape, and every time it rains, it's sitting in a bucket of water. You're asking for one of these root pathogens to infect it, because they have to have a lot of water, excessive amounts of water to infect. And so oftentimes if things are too wet, that's when we start to see these root diseases occur. And so, the entire plant will just die. This is a terrible photo. I'm sorry, but this got sent to me this week, and I just snapped a picture of it real quick with my cell phone and stuck it into the presentation. I could have done better than that. Shame on me. But this is a good example of root disease. So again, we look for that random pattern. This plant's fine, but these two are dead as a doorknob. So because of that random pattern, I'm thinking disease. And if I were to pull this plant up, which I did, and I looked at the roots would be black. And that's what these root pathogens do, is they kill the root. And then you get these symptoms like you would have in a nutritional deficiency, because the plant can't get the nutrition up to the plant that it needs from the roots. But I like to put this picture in here. What does a healthy root look like, and what does an infected root look like? That nice cream color, that's what a healthy root looks like. But if you have these black roots, that just indicates that they are toast. And that's what these pathogens will do to these roots. And then you start seeing symptoms like this: wilting. You think about it, they wilt because they can't get the water they need up there. They'll turn yellow because they can't get the proper nutrition up there. So it's all issues with the roots. And then again, this is talking about just some of the things I said. You get wilting, the whole thing will just go kaput. You get yellow symptoms. The yellow symptoms are called chlorosis. So that's just some of that. And then I want to talk about, soil diseases. They spread slowly. So if we were to imagine that this is a cotton field, I know we're talking about landscapes, but it's just a good idea to kind of think this way. But soil diseases spread very slowly. Like this would be how it spreads from year to year. But once it's there, it's hard to get rid of. But the way we get rid of plant soil diseases, we fix the water problem. A lot of times, if we can drain that area, get rid of the water issue, those diseases will go away. But something like these diseases that spread with spores that are blown around or splashed, they're just kind of everywhere, and they can travel fast, unlike the soil diseases. People ask me about their trees all the time. If you start seeing bracket fungi off your tree, it's usually a bad sign. That means there's some sort of rot going on internally. It's usually bad news. This is a photo that someone sent me of their apple tree, where their landscaper had just nicked their. It happens all the time. People, weed eaters, they get too close to trees and they will ding them up. But I wanted to just. This is what a rot looks like. If you kind of see this kind of water-soaked area that's kind of a lighter, it's kind of a color like that, a little bit of darker color. That when I saw that, I said, well, there's some rot present. And so then that rot can disrupt the vascular flow, and then you start seeing symptoms in the foliage. Okay, so we talked about fungal diseases. Let's talk a little bit about bacterial diseases. They're not 80% of plant disease, but they're about 10% of plant disease. It's really important. We talked to how water is important to fungi. For bacteria, it's super important. So they also have to have a very wet environment. Um, this, if you're looking at this, sometimes with tomatoes, they will get a bacterial wilt. And one thing I can do to check to see if it has a bacterial wilt is I can cut that tomato and I can stick it in a tube of water or in a cup, and a lot of times you can see that bacteria streaming out of the plant. That's what this is here. That's the bacteria streaming out. And the reason it kills the plant is because it plugs everything up on the inside and it can't transport water to the places that it needs. So that's why it causes the wilt. Um, but just some things we talked about leaf spots, but if you're trying to identify a bacterial leaf spot, they're a little bit different on what they look like. So a lot of times with a bacterial leaf spot, they kind of create a water soaked look. So if I were to hold this leaf up to the sunlight, a lot of times I can see through because it kind of soaks and deteriorates the area. And that's what bacterial leaf spots look like generally. I took this photo this week. This I got a big peach producer up here. He's having some issues with bacterial leaf spot. So I mentioned I can stick that tomato plant in like a thing of water, and I can watch that bacteria stream out. I can also dissect these leaf spots here, and I can watch it stream out from that infected tissue under the microscope. But anyway, but one thing I really want to bring your attention to is, do you see how these are real angular? They have sharp edges. Well, that is a real classic symptom of a bacterial leaf spot, is that they have very sharp edges. It's an angular leaf spot. The reason for that is, unlike fungi, bacteria don't possess the machinery to be able to cross leaf veins. So see how that disease stopped right at that leaf vein there? Um, like a fungus can produce that hyphae that we talked about, that kind of spider web looking material, and it can just crawl over your leaf and spread. But a bacteria, all a bacteria can do is they can land on that leaf and they can divide until they hit a wall and then they stop. So that's why you get an angular leaf spot a lot of times with bacterial diseases. This is, I got a sample of this week. If you have pears, good luck. Pears are so bad for getting a disease called fire blight. Apples get it too. But this is where, you know, a lot of times we've been talking about fungi, but fungal spores, a lot of times they can be picked up by the wind and blown around, or they can be water splashed. Well, bacteria have to be splashed onto another area, or they have to be picked up by something and moved. So with fire blight, what happens is the pollinators and flies get onto sap that has this bacteria in it. And when they fly over to your uninfected bloom, they basically inoculate that bloom with that bacteria. And then it gets into it and it starts plugging things up and it starts to kill that branch from the tip and then work its way down. That's how fire blight works. I want to talk. I'm not going to go into the details. I was actually talking to one of my colleagues today because she knows how much I love this disease or talking about it. I'm not going to get into too much of the details, but this is a bacterial disease called agrobacteria. The only reason I want to bring this up is, who here has heard of a GMO, a genetically modified organism? Well, a lot of people think of Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready soybeans. Well, this bacteria is how they created the first GMOs, and it's so cool. What this black bacteria does, I'll go back to this slide. You see these big, goofy looking galls that are on the root. How it created those is, when a plant is wounded, it puts off this certain chemical called acetosyringo, but it puts off this wounded plant chemical. It triggers this bacteria to insert a special ring of DNA into the plant. And then that DNA goes into the plant cell and it combines with its DNA, and it turns off and on genes. And so it'll turn on genes that make the plant divide a bunch, so you get a big gall. It'll turn on genes that make it produce a lot of sugars, and so basically it creates its perfect vacation home. But scientists figured out, hey, why don't I just put the DNA that I want to put into the plant into this bacteria and just let it deliver it? And that's how a lot of GMOs still to this day are created in a lab, as with this plant disease. Pretty cool. All right, so let's talk about nematodes. A lot of people haven't even heard of nematodes before. They're not so much of an issue up here where we're at, like they are down in South Georgia in that sandy soil. But these are microscopic. You couldn't see them without a microscope. And what they do is they'll really mess the roots up of plants. So most nematodes have a little needle at the end of their nose. They're called a stylet, and they will stab roots and feed on them, and then can cause them to gall up and look all crazy. This real common nematode issue is called root knot nematode. This is what it does to, this is a tomato plant here, but you can notice, look at the roots. They look all bumpy and crazy. Well, that's where this nematode had gone in, and it had stung that root, and it caused that swelling to occur. And of course, that screws up the roots and then causes them to wilt because they can't get the water up, or show some of these other nutritional deficiency symptoms. There's actually also foliar nematodes, and we have some of those up here. This is of course hostas here. They get foliar nematodes sometimes. But looking at nematodes in the lab, or in the past, is kind of fun because you stick them into the Petri plate, and then you take a lighter and you just go under your slide, and it kind of stuns them, and then you can look at them under the microscope. But you can get them that they'll splash onto foliage, and then they will start to mess things up. They're rare up here because they don't really like our clay soils, but I did get a sample in not too long ago. This is a moonflower. That is the root knot nematode right there. And the female root knot nematodes, as soon as they stab in, they're there forever, and they essentially become an egg factory. So they stab in, and then they just produce eggs, and then the issue gets worse and worse. The only way to deal with nematodes in our landscapes is with planting resistant varieties. There's no nematicides. They do have nematicides, but you have to have a license to be able to put those out. So we don't have landscapers, and citizens just without a license don't have the ability to put out nematicides. So you have to put out resistant varieties that are more resistant to that nematode. But let's talk about viruses too. So this is the last one I want to talk about in the different types of diseases. The viruses, they're more rare, but they can, once a plant gets a virus, it's toast. If your plant gets a virus, there's nothing you can do. It's going to die. And they will cause all sorts of symptoms. This symptom here is called mottling. So you can see it really looks kind of cool, actually. In fact, there's some people that have flowers that they will purposely put a virus into that flower to give the petals a really interesting look. But viruses, a virus has to be spread through a vector. And what I mean by that is a vector is anything that will chew on that plant, pick up that virus, and move it somewhere else. Or it could be us. A lot of insects will transmit viruses from one plant to another. They chew on the plant, they pick up the virus on their mouth parts, and then when they chew on the next plant, that's how it will get into that plant. There's the real tobacco mosaic virus. Back when tobacco was a big crop, a lot of workers, because tobacco had to be hand-picked, a lot of workers in the field would spread this disease because that virus is actually active in cigarettes. So a lot of the workers would be smoking cigarettes, and they would get that virus on their hand, and they'd spread it through the field. So a lot of farmers required their workers to wash their hands in between taking cigarette breaks, or just better not to smoke cigarettes, I guess. But another thing that viruses cause, if you ever see this symptom here, it's called a ring spot. Viruses are the only thing that makes a symptom like that. If it looks like a ring, it's a virus. So that's pretty a dead giveaway if you ever saw a ring spot. But the most common virus that so many people are concerned about in their landscape is rose rosette disease. And if your plant gets this disease, your roses, they are going to die. It is probably going to be 3 to 5 years, but in that time, eventually they will die. And it's spread by a very tiny mite that when it is so tiny, it's called an aerified mite. It's so tiny that it actually can be blown in the wind from one plant to the other. And when it chews on your plant, it picks up that viruses and moves it to your other rose plant. But viruses do crazy things to plants. They make them look wacky. See all this excessive thorns. It messes up the genetic material in the plant and causes it to do crazy things like that. And you'll get a lot of these red shoots come out, these crazy looking shoots. It's all what the virus does. And you can't just prune that virus out. Once that plant has it, it's in the plant and it's going to kill it eventually. So if you see rose rosette, you may as well just, it's hard, pull that plant up because it can help reduce the spread to your other roses. This is in a Chick-fil-A next to my office. This plant is going to die. And I actually have been monitoring it over the last year or two, and it's getting worse. So anyway, maybe I need to tell him to try to get a free Chick-fil-A sandwich or something. But anyway, but this is some other symptoms of rose rosette. It's just the spookiest thing. And what's so spooky about it is your plant could be infected for years before it ever shows symptoms. So sometimes that's how it would spread from nurseries, is the plant looked fine and then the nurseries would sell it out, and then they basically sold something that was infected and they didn't even know it. So and we're still learning so much about this disease, and we don't even know what causes those symptoms to come on still. We don't know why it's years down the line, or it could be the next day. And the last symptom I'll talk about with viruses is they can cause a mosaic. So here is some squash that got a virus. You can see it makes this real crazy pattern on them. So they'll cause like a mosaic virus. But virus is very interesting. I didn't study viruses. I studied fungi, but they get pretty crazy. So the last thing I'll kind of leave you with, and I have plenty of diseases I took pictures of if we want to kind of go through common landscape ones that we're seeing right now. But to prevent disease, the best way to deal with disease is prevention. And once we see a problem, it's way harder to deal with it than if we prevented it from happening in the first place. But so some of the things we talked about: have good sanitation practices, clean up those leaves. If you do have leaf spot, get rid of all those dead leaves underneath the plant, and that will help prevent disease later. Also, if you have like a vegetable garden and you till, when you till that soil, you can bury those leaves. And then that way, the only way those spores can spread is through wind dispersal. If you bury them, they're not going anywhere. And it's not like they're going to infect the roots for like the leaf spot diseases. So you can sanitize the area, get rid of those leaves, bury them. The right plant in the right place. If you can do anything to prevent stress, that's going to make your plant have a better ability to cope with these diseases. So plant in the correct shading. If it likes shade, put it in shade. If it likes to have a real wet environment, or give it the amount of water it needs, give it the proper nutrition, do anything you can to prevent that plant from getting stressed. And then a lot of times it can deal with these diseases on its own. And then you can use resistant cultivars, eliminate disease-prone plants. If you know this always is an issue in your area, just don't plant it there. And then, as a last resort, if we need it, we can use chemical control with fungicides. And then, of course, as long as we're applying those according to the label, they work great, and they are safe when applied correctly according to the label. So I thank you guys for your attention. I have lots of pictures of different diseases that I've seen. They're kind of at the end of this presentation, but we're kind of running low on time. So I'd be happy to take any questions that any of you may have.
Thank you, Garrett. I think we have like 2 questions so far in the chat box. And also, if you are still here with us, once we finish these two questions in the chat box, if you think your question is too long, you can just unmute yourself and like ask your questions as well. So the first question here, I found cone-shaped mushrooms in my palm tree. The tree was in the house until mid-May. Do I need to do anything for this problem? I removed the mushroom, I could say, from the plant.
Yeah, if it was in just the pot itself, I'd be certain that it's fine. So, most mushrooms, and when we think of fungi, a lot of times the first thing we think of is mushrooms, but there's not a lot of mushrooms that are pathogenic towards plants. There's one in particular that's in peaches, but for your palm plant, if you just saw a mushroom in the pot, it's totally fine. Most fungi actually are called saprophytes. So that means they're there because they like to chew on dead and decaying material. So when a tree falls in the woods and it starts to break down, you see a bunch of fungi growing on it. Most fungi just are there because of the wood chips you have around your plants, like if it's a mushroom, or if there's a lot of organic matter in that potting soil. So just because there's a mushroom there, it's actually not hurting your plant at all. It's probably there because of it's eating that stuff in the pot.